The last thing Sergeant Dara Voss remembered from her own time was the smell of diesel and a truck that hadn't bothered to brake. She woke up wrong. Not the wrong that comes after a bad night or a bad dream. The wrong that comes when your hands don't match your hands, when the ceiling is too high and the light is the color of something that has never touched earth. She sat up slowly, breathing through the wrongness, and counted what she knew. Her name, her rank, her last posting, Forward Operating Base Kimathi, East African Sector, during the 3rd year of the Kreth incursion. The date of the accident, March 14, 2041. The date on the glowing panel above her bed, November 3, 2189. She looked at her hands for a long time. They were not her hands. The knuckles were different. The scar she'd gotten in Lagos from a piece of broken glass, gone. These were the hands of someone younger, someone who had not spent 3 years in the field. She pressed them flat against the mattress and felt the texture of something that was almost fabric but not quite, and she thought, okay, you have been in bad situations before. Work the problem. A door that was not a door, more a seam in the wall that exhaled itself open, admitted a woman in gray who moved like she was always 3 steps ahead of the room. She had a tablet in one hand and the expression of someone who gives the same speech twice a day and has long since stopped believing it. "Sergeant Voss," the woman said, not looking up. "How do you feel?" "Like I'm in someone else's body." The woman made a small, practiced smile. "That's accurate. I'm Dr. Maeve Carolan, Hereafter Insurance Corporation Reclamation Division. You've been transferred into a host body registered to the corporation. You're in the year 2189, and before you ask, yes, it's permanent. Yes, it's legal. And yes, you'll be compensated." Dara said, "Compensated for what?" Carolan finally looked up. She had the eyes of someone who had answered this question enough times that she'd stopped really hearing it. "For the inconvenience." Dara stared at her. "I was hit by a truck." "You were retrieved at the moment of biological cessation. Your consciousness was preserved in buffer storage and subsequently transferred. The host body was volunteered legally by its previous occupant, who has moved on to the hereafter. You are alive. You are healthy. You are, technically speaking, one of the lucky ones." There was a window behind Carolan, and through it Dara could see a city that New York had grown into in the intervening century and a half. It was not a bad city. It was not a good city. It was a city that had been built by people who had stopped being afraid of death, and in doing so had built something that had quietly stopped being alive. The architecture was beautiful in the way that a very expensive coffin is beautiful. It gleamed. It did not breathe. "What happened to the Kreth?" Dora asked. That was when Carolan stopped moving. The pause was small, barely a second, but Dara had spent 3 years reading people in situations where reading people wrong got you killed, and she felt it the way you feel a tripwire. Not with your eyes, but with some older sense, some pre-language alarm that lives behind the sternum. "The Kreth incursion," Carolan said carefully, "concluded in 2044. We won." Another pause, smaller this time. Dara was already sure of the answer before it came. "There was a negotiated settlement," Carolan said. "I'll have someone bring you orientation materials." She left, the seam in the wall side shut behind her. Dara sat in the bed that was not her bed, in the body that was not her body, in a year that was not her year, and thought about what a negotiated settlement meant when one side of the negotiation had faster ships, better weapons, and biology that didn't require oxygen to function. She thought about the soldiers who had been at FOB Kimathi when she'd left, their faces as specific to her as her own hands. She thought about Private Yusuf Ademi, who used to hum while he cleaned his rifle, who had a daughter he'd never met. She thought about Captain Reyes, who kept a photograph of Lake Titicaca folded in her left boot, because she said she needed something beautiful nearby when things got ugly. She thought negotiated settlement. Then she got up, because the alternative was lying in a bed that wasn't hers and waiting for a future that was already over. The city was called New Manhattan, which was the least imaginative name anyone had given anything in human history, and it was run by 4 corporations who had quietly replaced everything the government had once done and done it with better efficiency and worse morality. The Hereafter Insurance Corporation was the largest. It sold afterlife policies, genuine, scientifically verified afterlives, accessible to anyone who could afford the premium. For those who couldn't, there was a lottery. For those who won the lottery, there was the standard transfer package. For those who didn't win and couldn't pay, there was what the city's residents, with the dark humor of people who had been living adjacent to death for so long that death had stopped being scary, called the Long Walk. Dara learned this from a man named Sammy Jones, who ran a food stand on the corner of what used to be 47th Street, and now had a number for a name instead of a word. Sammy Jones was approximately 60 years old in a body that was approximately 30, which meant he was either very wealthy or had taken the lottery twice and won both times. He had the cheerful philosophy of someone who had spent a long time being afraid of things and had decided, pragmatically, to stop. "You're a reclamation," he said, handing her a container of something that smelled like coffee and tasted like coffee's more successful cousin. "Can always tell. You've got that look." "What look?" "Like you just found out the neighborhood changed while you were sleeping." He leaned on his counter and looked at her with the frank curiosity of someone who sold things for a living and therefore understood people as inventory. "What year?" 2041. He whistled. "Long time. What was it like, the incursion?" "It was like a war," Dara said. "It was like every war. It was ugly and it went on too long and then it stopped." "We lost," Sammy said, not unkindly. "Caroline told me it was a negotiated settlement." "That's corporation language." "The Creth got the outer belt, full mineral rights and a permanent exclusion zone around their home systems. We got to keep breathing. Most people think that was a good trade." He paused, then added, "Most people in 2044 had never been in the field." Dara drank the coffee-adjacent thing and looked at the city. Somewhere above it, in the translucent skin of the upper atmosphere, she could see the faint shimmer of what Caroline's orientation materials had called the diplomatic membrane, the permanent monitoring station the Creth had insisted on as part of the settlement. It was described in the materials as a gesture of mutual trust. It looked, from this angle and in this light, like a lid on a jar. She thought about that for a while. "The Creth," she said, "are they still here, Earthside?" Sammy considered her. Something in his expression shifted, became a little more careful, like a man recalculating a distance. "They've got an embassy," he said, "down near what used to be the UN building. Been there since the settlement. They don't come out much." He paused again. "The current ambassador has been there for 40 years. They don't rotate. Creth live a long time." "What's the ambassador like?" Sammy smiled then, and it was a smile with too much history in it to read clearly. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "Ask someone else that question. I don't know enough about her to say anything accurate, and I know enough about her to be careful." That night in the room the corporation had assigned her, small, clean, functional, the room of someone who has been processed, rather than welcomed, Dara read everything she could find on the Creth ambassador to Earth. Her name, translated from Creth into something human mouths could shape, was something like Valandris, though most of the diplomatic record referred to her simply as the ambassador. She was, by Creth standards, young. She was the first of her kind to have spent significant time in continuous proximity to humans. The previous ambassador had conducted all meetings through intermediaries, through the sealed glass of formal chambers, through the careful buffer of protocol. Valandris had requested a posting that allowed direct contact. This had been considered unusual. The files didn't say what the Creth thought of it. The human diplomatic corps seemed to consider it a good sign without being entirely sure why. There were no photographs of her. Creth didn't photograph well, something about the way they processed light or the way light processed them. Dara couldn't follow the technical explanation. There were descriptions, tall by human standards, bilateral symmetry, but the proportions were wrong in ways that the body's old instincts registered before the rational mind could catch up. Eyes, and every description mentioned the eyes, that were described with the same reaching vocabulary people used when trying to explain something that didn't have a word yet. Deep, still, the color of deep water in a place where things lived that had never seen sun. Dara stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she thought about the diplomatic membrane that looked like a lid on a jar, about a negotiated settlement that nobody had celebrated, about a war that had ended not with victory or defeat, but with the slow withdrawal of one side to a position of permanent surveillance. She thought about what it meant to be watching. In the morning, she went to the embassy. The building that had once housed the United Nations had been given to the Kreth as part of the settlement. They had not changed it. This was, the diplomatic files suggested, intentional, a demonstration of the Kreth belief that the spaces where negotiations occurred should be preserved as monuments to their outcomes. The flags of 100 nations still flew outside, though many of those nations had been reorganized beyond recognition in the century and a half since Dara's time. The Kreth flag flew among them, a single unbroken line of deep violet on black, which Kreth scholars who communicated with human academics had explained represented continuity without end, and which most humans who looked at it saw as a horizon at night and felt, without knowing why, a little afraid. The guards at the entrance were human, private security contracted by the corporation. They checked her identity and found, correctly, that she was registered as a reclamation, and therefore technically a ward of the corporation, and therefore technically not entitled to independent diplomatic access. She waited until the guard checked his tablet a second time, and found a note that hadn't been there a moment before. The note said, in crisp corporate formatting, Sergeant Dara Voss, retired, is granted access at ambassador's request. The guard looked up at her with the expression of someone who has just discovered that his checklist doesn't cover the situation he's in. He stood aside. Dara had been in rooms where she was the least powerful person present. She knew how to walk through them. She walked through this one. The interior of the building was the same as it had been in her time and also completely different. The way a face you've known for years is the same when it looks back at you from a photograph taken before you were born. The same bones, the wrong light. The assembly hall had been cleared of its original furniture. In its place was a space of controlled emptiness that had been constructed, she realized slowly, not for human comfort or human scale, but as a compromise between two entirely different spatial philosophies. There were places to sit that worked for human bodies. There were places to stand that worked for something larger, something that thought about space differently. At the far end of the hall, backlit by the northern windows that looked toward where the membrane shimmered in the upper sky, Valandris was standing. Dara stopped walking. She had read the descriptions. She had prepared herself. She had spent 3 years in the field learning to prepare herself for things that preparedness couldn't actually touch. The ambassador was tall in the way that mountains are tall, not just in measurement but in quality, in the way she occupied the vertical axis of the room as though she had been the reason for it. She was bilaterally symmetrical, as the files said, but the files had failed to convey what that symmetry felt like in person. A precision that human symmetry, with its small deviations and natural asymmetries, reached for and never quite found. Her face was a face, eyes, mouth, the structural suggestions of expression, but organized around different priorities, different emotional logics, the way a word in one language can mean something close to but not identical with its translation. Her skin, or what served the function of skin, caught the northern light and kept it, held it in a way that organic tissue didn't usually do. Her eyes were the color described in the files, and the files had been right that the color didn't have a word, and the files had been wrong about almost everything else. They were not just deep. They were attentive in a way Dara had never seen attention work before. Not the focused attention of a predator or the careful attention of a diplomat, but something older. Something that had been paying attention for much longer than humans had been worth paying attention to. Something that had kept watching through all the years of the incursion, and the settlement, and the 40 years of the embassy, and the 150 years since the truck on the New Jersey highway. Dara looked into those eyes and said the first true thing that came to her, which was, "You have beautiful eyes." The silence that followed was very long. Valandris tilted her head. It was a small movement, precise, the kind of movement that in a human face would telegraph surprise or recalibration. In hers it was harder to read, which Dara chose to interpret as a good sign. "You are not what I expected," the ambassador said. Her voice came from somewhere in the chest cavity, resonant, with harmonics underneath it like overtones on a bell. Her English was perfect in a way that native speakers almost never achieved, every word exactly weighted, nothing elided. "Nobody ever is," Dara said. "What were you expecting?" "A diplomat. I'm a soldier. A dead soldier. A resurrected one. There's a difference." Dara moved to one of the chairs that had been designed for human bodies and sat in it, slowly, keeping her hands visible and her posture open in the body language of someone who wasn't armed and wanted you to know it. "You requested my access. I reviewed your file when you were transferred. Soldiers from the incursion era are rare in reclamation." A pause. "Most of your kind did not survive to the point of retrieval." "Most of my kind," Dara said, and the word kind landed between them like a stone in still water. Valandris did not flinch from it. "I meant the era, not the species." She moved closer, which in the scale of the room meant she crossed half of it in what seemed like too few steps. Up close, the quality of her attention was even more apparent, the sense of being seen not just in the present moment but in context, in history, as a point on a longer line. "You were a sergeant, Ground Forces, East African Sector. You survived 3 years of direct engagement." "I survived until a truck hit me." "Yes." Something moved across the ambassador's face that Dara couldn't catalog. "I have read the accounts of your engagement, particularly the incident at what your forces called the Kestrel Gorge." Dara went very still. Kestrel Gorge, January 2043. 14 soldiers and 1 functioning radio, surrounded for 11 days by a Kreth sensor net that should have been able to see them breathing from orbit. They'd survived because Adami, Private Yusuf Adami, who hummed while he cleaned his rifle, had figured out that the Kreth sensors operated on a specific M frequency that their own equipment emitted on a slightly different band. He'd rewired 6 field radios in 2 hours using a multi-tool and a piece of wire from someone's bootlace. They'd walked out of the gorge in a blind spot they'd built themselves, carrying their dead and their wounded and the radio, and the Kreth had never figured out how. "What about it?" Dara said. "I have never understood how you escaped the sensor perimeter." Valandris said it without accusation, without the specific tone of grievance that the word escaped might have carried. She said it the way a scientist states a problem, with genuine curiosity, with the particular quality of attention that means "I have been thinking about this for a long time." "Trade secret," Dara said. The ambassador looked at her for a moment. Then she did something that Dara's hindbrain registered as a smile before her frontal lobe had caught up, something in the arrangement of her face, in the quality of stillness, that carried the information a smile carries without being one. "Sit with me," Valandris said. "I would like to speak with you about a number of things." "Am I a prisoner?" "You were never a prisoner. You were never a subject. You were briefly an enemy, and then you were gone, and then you were a ghost, and now you are here." She moved to one of the standing positions that had been built for her scale, something between sitting and standing by human measurement, and settled into it with a quality of patience that suggested she had been waiting a long time and had made her peace with waiting. "The settlement was a mistake," she said. Not the survival clause, the architecture of the settlement, the membrane, the exclusion zones. She looked out the northern windows. We built a frame around your species as though you were a problem to be contained. I have spent 40 years watching you through that frame. Dara said nothing. I was very young, Valendris said, by the standards of my kind when the incursion was concluded. I requested this posting because I disagreed with my council about what the settlement would produce. She paused. I was correct, but being correct about a mistake is not the same as being able to prevent it. What did you think it would produce? Exactly this, she looked back at Dara. A species that has stopped being afraid of death, administered by institutions that sell them transcendence, watched by a monitoring station they are too polite or too exhausted to object to. The humanity I studied before the incursion, the humanity in the accounts, in the archives, in the testimony of my predecessors, was not this. It was louder, more difficult, more interesting. She paused again. More dangerous. Dara thought about the city she'd walked through that morning. The beautiful coffin architecture. The man named Sammy Jones who ran a food stand and had made his peace with the way things were. You're describing people, she said, who have been managed. Yes. And you're the ambassador of the species that negotiated the management. Yes. So what do you want from me? Valendris looked at her with those eyes that held light the way deep water holds cold, keeping it, not releasing it, and said, I want to know how Sergeant Dara Voss and 13 other soldiers walked out of a Kreth sensor net that should have been airtight. Dara looked at her for a long time. Why, she finally said. Because my council believes, Valendris said quietly, that humanity has been neutralized, that the settlement was not a pause but a conclusion, that you are, as a species, now managed, predictable, stable, no longer a variable that requires active consideration. She paused. I do not believe this, and in 11 days there will be a council review of the settlement terms. If I cannot demonstrate that the variable is still active, the monitoring will be upgraded. The membrane will be replaced with something more substantial. She met Dara's eyes. More permanent. The word sat between them. Dara thought about the lid on the jar. She thought about Private Adami and his multi-tool, and his wire from a bootlace, and his 2 hours of working in the dark with the enemy overhead. She thought about what it meant to still be a variable. Tell me about the review, she said. The review convened at the orbital station the Kreth called the continuity point, which was as close to poetry as their language got in translation, and which humans in the diplomatic corps had taken to calling the checkpoint, which was closer to accuracy. It sat at the L2 point of Earth-Moon system, exactly positioned so that nothing could happen on Earth's surface without the station seeing it first. Valendris had brought Dara up on a diplomatic shuttle, technically illegal, technically invisible to the audit trail, made possible by the kind of institutional authority that 40 years in the same posting accumulates, and the kind of moral conviction that overrides the instinct to preserve your career. In the shuttle, at the L2 approach, Dara had looked back at Earth and thought about all the times she'd looked at it from the ground, and wondered what it looked like from above. It looked like something worth keeping. The continuity point was, in Kreth architecture, what the embassy building had been in human architecture, a statement about spatial philosophy. It was large in the way of things built by species for whom interior volume is a form of communication. The bigger the space, the more serious the communication. The council chamber was the largest space Dara had ever stood in. It made the assembly hall of the old UN building feel like a waiting room. There were 9 council members. They sat in the Kreth fashion, a standing posture that had no direct human equivalent, something between standing and the position a human might call sitting forward, in a curved arrangement that had no head position, no obvious place of authority, which was itself a statement about how Kreth authority worked. They were all old. Dara didn't have the sensory equipment to read Kreth's age precisely, but there was something about the quality of their stillness, the particular texture of their attention, that communicated accumulated time the way a very old tree communicates it, not in wrinkles or gray hair, but in the particular quality of rootedness. They watched Dara walk in with the specific quality of attention she'd learned to recognize in the files, the attention of observers who had been watching for a long time and had already formed their conclusions. Vailendra stood beside her and spoke first, in Kreth, and a translation appeared in the small earpiece Dara had been given. The ambassador was arguing her case, had been arguing it for 40 years, apparently, building toward this specific request in this specific session. She was asking the council to reconsider the membrane. She was presenting evidence that the monitoring itself had changed what was being monitored. She was making an argument that Dara, listening to the translation, recognized from a different context. The argument that containment creates the very pressure it's trying to prevent. The council listened. Their expressions were unreadable to Dara, but their stillness had a quality she'd learned to read, the stillness of people who had already decided. When Vailendris finished, one of the council members, older than the others, her stillness more absolute, her eyes the same color as the ambassador's but deeper somehow, as though she had been watching from further back, spoke. The translation came. The ambassador presents an interesting sentiment. The data does not support it. Human civilization has been stable for 145 years under current monitoring protocols. We see no evidence of the variable the ambassador describes. Dara said, "That's because you're looking for it in the wrong place." The council member who had spoken turned her attention to Dara. All 9 of them did, simultaneously, with the quality of a coordinated movement that hadn't required coordination. "The soldier speaks," the same council member said. "The soldier does," Dara agreed. She had spent a lot of time in rooms where she was the least powerful person present. She had learned that the least powerful person in a room is also, in a certain sense, the most free. She has the least to protect. You're looking for evidence of the variable in the data, in the outputs, in the stability indexes and the population metrics and the diplomatic filings. But you've been watching us from a monitoring station for 145 years. What does a lab rat do in a cage when there's no way out? "It adapts," the old council member said. "It waits," Dara said. "It builds a different relationship with time. It starts thinking in longer terms than it used to. It becomes very, very patient." She paused. "That's what you've been misreading as stability. That's what the data looks like when a variable isn't dormant. It looks like it's waiting." Silence in the chamber. The quality of Kreth's silence was something she'd gotten used to faster than she'd expected. It was not the silence of people uncomfortable with silence, but of people for whom silence was a form of speech, a mode of communication. This silence had a texture she couldn't read. She pressed forward. "I was in a sensor net your people built in 2043, she said. 14 soldiers, surrounded. We should have been invisible to ourselves before we were invisible to you. We were running out of food, we were running out of water, we were carrying wounded. We had one radio between us and most of it was held together by wire from someone's bootlace." She let that sit for a moment. "We walked out, not because we had better technology than you, not because we got lucky. Because one of my soldiers sat in the dark with what he had and figured out something about your sensor net that your engineers hadn't thought of. Because humans do that. Because when you take everything away from us, we start looking at what we have left and asking different questions about it." The old council member said, "1 soldier in 2043, 1 data point." "Private Yusuf Adami," Dara said. "He has a daughter. Her name is Amara. She was born in 2044 after the settlement. She is 145 years old and she works as an atmospheric engineer." She paused. "She has a daughter too. Her daughter's name is Layla. Layla Adami is 23 years old. Last year she published a paper on M-frequency propagation in high-atmosphere conditions that your physics division apparently found interesting enough to flag. She looked at the old council member directly. I looked that up this morning. I've been in this century for exactly 4 days. Another silence, different texture. One data point, Dara said, becomes 2, becomes a lineage, becomes a pattern you've been watching and misidentifying for 145 years. She stood up a little straighter in the body that was not her body, in the year that was not her year, in the chamber of a species that had beaten her species in the field, and then made the mistake of thinking they'd beaten them everywhere else too. You wanted to know how we walked out of the gorge. Adami rewired 6 field radios in 2 hours using a multi-tool and wire from a bootlace. And he did it because he'd been sitting in the dark long enough to notice something about your sensor net that your engineers, who had never been trapped by it, had never needed to notice. That's the variable you've been monitoring. And you've been watching it stabilize for so long that you've confused patience with surrender. She sat back down. The chamber was quiet. Valandris had not moved during any of this. She stood in the Kreth standing-sitting posture with the quality of patience that meant she had been waiting for exactly this moment for 40 years and was now letting it arrive at its own pace. The old council member looked at Dara for a long time with those deep-water eyes. Then she looked at Valandris. Something passed between them that the translation didn't catch: tone, inflection, the sub-frequencies that carried the actual weight of Kreth communication. Then the council member said, in perfect, deliberate English, "What would you ask of us?" Dara blinked. She had not expected the question. She had prepared for a no. She had prepared for a polite acknowledgement and a quiet dismissal and an upgraded membrane by the end of the week. She had not prepared for the question. She thought about what she actually wanted. She thought about the city that was too clean and too quiet and built like a beautiful coffin. She thought about the man named Sammy Jones who had made his peace. She thought about a woman named Marie Thorne who had called her from across the lobby of the corporation building that morning to say that she'd heard about the visit to the embassy and that there were others, other reclamations, other soldiers from the incursion era, other people who had woken up in the wrong year and found themselves looking at the membrane from below, who wanted to be in this room. They hadn't been able to be in this room. There hadn't been time. There hadn't been access. There needed to be time. There needed to be access. Pull the membrane, she said. Not reduce it, not reconfigure it, pull it. Let us breathe without the lid on. She paused. And open the review process, not to diplomats, to people. There are 145 years of people who have been living under a settlement that was decided before they were born. Let them speak. That is a very large request, the council member said. You asked what I'd ask, Dora said. That's what I'm asking. Another silence. This one lasted long enough that Dara started to believe it was an answer. Then Valandris spoke, in Kreth, then in English, and the translation came fractionally after. I have been here for 40 years. I have watched what the ambassador described. I have disagreed with my council for 40 years about what we were watching. I am asking you to give me the opportunity to be right about this in a way that doesn't require you to take my word for it. She paused. Give it 3 years. Observe without the membrane. If the variable is truly dormant, the data in 3 years will confirm it, and you can rebuild something more substantial than what you had. If it isn't dormant, she paused again. If it isn't, then you will have something worth watching. The old council member said nothing for a long time. Then 3 years. Valandris looked at Dara. In that look was something that Dara's vocabulary didn't have a word for. The look of someone who has been holding a very long argument in one hand for a very long time and has just felt the other person take some of the weight. 3 years, Dara agreed. They took the shuttle back to Earth in silence for the first hour. The planet grew in the forward window from a circle to a presence, from a thing you could hold in your visual field to a thing that was beginning to hold you. The Terminator line, the boundary between the sunlit and dark sides, moved at its own absolute pace, indifferent to shuttles and settlements and species and the particular significance of this specific descent. Valandris sat across the narrow aisle in the configuration her body required, which was not sitting exactly but was the closest word for it. She was looking at the planet. Dara watched her for a while and then said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why did you access my file? You said you review the files of reclamation transfers from the incursion era. Why?" The ambassador looked at her. In the shuttle's interior light, her eyes were even harder to describe than they'd been in the high-windowed spaces of the embassy. Dara had stopped trying to describe them and had started just looking at them, which was different. "Because I was there," Valandris said. "Not at the gorge specifically, at the incursion. I was very young, as I said, and I was in a role that did not involve direct combat. I was a junior interpreter. I processed communications, interrogated captured materials." She paused. "I read the reports. I read all the reports. I read about the humans who did things that our models had not predicted, who used what they had in ways that our engineers hadn't anticipated, who, when surrounded and outgunned and outresourced in every measurable way, sat in the dark and asked different questions." She looked back at the planet. "I thought, when the settlement was concluded, that we had made a very significant mistake. Not in the terms were reasonable. In the premise. We treated the outcome of the incursion as data about what humanity could do. I thought it was data about what humanity could do when it was not waiting. And now I have watched for 40 years, and I have read every file of every reclamation from the incursion era, and I have found a handful of people, not many, but some, who woke up in this year with the specific quality of attention that the dormant population does not have." She paused. "You looked at the membrane on your first day. I know because the embassy has sensors, not surveillance but presence indicators, and I can tell where new reclamations direct their attention. Almost all of them look at the city. You looked at the sky." Dara said nothing. "That is why I accessed your file," Valandris said. "That is why I put your name on the access list." She paused for the last time. "And that is why, when you told me I had beautiful eyes, I did something no one expected." Dara looked at her. "What did you do?" "I believed you," the ambassador said, "and I decided to let you speak." There was a long quiet after that. The Terminator line kept moving. The planet kept growing. Somewhere below them, in the beautiful coffin of a city, Sammy Jones was running his food stand and thinking the thoughts of a man who had made his peace with things. Somewhere in an office in the corporation building, Maeve Carolan was delivering the same speech she delivered twice a day with the same practiced smile. Somewhere in an atmospheric engineering lab, Layla Adami was working on something about M-frequency propagation in high-atmosphere conditions that a monitoring station in orbit had flagged as interesting. 3 years, Dara said. 3 years, Valandris agreed. What happens after 3 years if the data doesn't go the way you predicted? The ambassador considered this with the specific quality of consideration that 40 years of watching had given her. Unhurried, exhaustive, the consideration of someone who has learned that the right answer to a wrong question is a different question. "I think," she said at last, "that if we are in this shuttle together again in 3 years, you will have made it irrelevant." Dara looked at the planet. She thought about Private Adami in the dark with his multi-tool and his wire and his 2 hours of careful attention. She thought about what it means to notice something that everyone else has stopped noticing because they've been looking at it from the same angle for too long. She thought about the body that wasn't hers, with its unmarked knuckles and its absent scar, and the year that wasn't hers, with its beautiful coffin city and its managed peace and its long patient waiting. She thought about Layla Adami, 23 years old, publishing papers that orbital stations flagged as interesting. She thought 3 years is enough time. Then she thought 3 years is probably not enough time. Then she thought what she'd thought on the first morning, in the bed that wasn't hers, in the body that wasn't hers, with the city outside the window that was too clean and too quiet. Okay, you have been in bad situations before. Work the problem. The shuttle hit atmosphere. The friction light gathered at the edges of the forward window, orange and then white, the color of something being tested by contact with a world that doesn't yet know what it's getting. Dara Voss folded her hands in her lap, the hands that weren't her hands, with the knuckles she didn't recognize. And for the first time since she'd woken up wrong, in the wrong year, in the wrong body, in the wrong aftermath of the wrong ending to the wrong war, she thought, maybe not wrong, maybe just different, maybe just early. The planet rose to meet them. She was ready. 6 months later, the first of what the press called the open sessions convened in the old UN Assembly Hall, which the Kreth Embassy quietly made available. It was not a diplomatic event. It was not a formal proceeding. It was, by design and deliberate looseness, something harder to categorize. A room full of people who had been alive during different eras of the same continuity, trying to say what they remembered to people who had never had the option of remembering it. Dora sat in the back. She had helped organize it. She had made the calls, sent the messages, tracked down other reclamations who had woken up looking at the sky instead of the city. She had found 7 of them so far. There were probably more. The corporation's files were not organized by the variable Valandris had identified. Nobody had known to look for it. Marie Thorne was up front, speaking to a room of several hundred people about what the incursion had felt like from the civilian logistics side, about what the negotiations had felt like to someone who had been in the room where the settlement terms were finalized, about what the years afterward had felt like to someone who had watched the city become what it became and had not known what to do with that knowledge. She was not a remarkable speaker. She was a precise one. She said exactly what she meant in exactly the words she meant to say it, and the room was very quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when they're listening rather than just hearing. Dara watched the room. In the back corner near the wall stood a tall figure. She had come alone and stood apart, in the standing posture that had no human equivalent, watching the room with the same quality of attention she'd given Dara on the first day in the embassy. She was not part of the proceedings. She was not a participant. She was exactly what she'd been for 40 years, and also, somehow, not that at all. Dara caught her eye from across the room. The ambassador tilted her head, small, precise. Dara held up her hand, not a wave exactly, something quieter, more specific, the small human gesture that means, I see you. I'm glad you're here. Valandris looked at her with those eyes that held light like deep water holds cold, and did the thing that was like a smile without being one. Outside, above the city, the place where the membrane had been was already different, not empty, but open, the way a room feels different after you've taken down a wall that you'd stopped noticing was there. The upper atmosphere moved through itself without interruption. The sky was a sky again rather than a diagram of a sky. In a lab somewhere in the city, Layla Adami was working on something. In 6 months and 3 years, and the particular interval between them, nobody knew what it would be. That, Dara thought, watching the room, was the whole point. The second open session happened 3 weeks after the first, and the third happened 1 week after that. The pace picked up the way fires pick up, not by being fed but by finding what was already there and choosing it. Dara didn't run the sessions. That had been a deliberate choice. The sessions needed to belong to the people in them, not to the woman who'd stood up in front of a Kreth council and made a case. She organized logistics, she made calls, she tracked down records and made sure the right people had access to each other. But she sat in the back, most of the time, and listened. She was learning a lot. The century and a half she'd missed was not, it turned out, as dormant as it looked from the outside. The membrane had flattened the signal, smoothed out the variation in a way that made the data look stable. But the variation had still been there, in the low-frequency oscillations that the monitoring station hadn't been calibrated to notice. People had been doing things. Slow things, quiet things, things in labs and workshops and the backs of apartments, and the corners of conversations that had never been significant enough to register on any of the indexes, the corporation reported to the council. There was a woman named Hiroshi Tanaka. She had changed her name at 60 as a form of statement and kept it for the remaining 130 years of her very long life, who had spent 80 years developing a theory of M propagation that had started, she said in her session recording, from a paper she'd read as a young woman. The paper had been by Lila Adami. Tanaka had never met Adami. She had read a paper, been struck by something in it that she couldn't articulate at the time, and spent 80 years following that thing she couldn't articulate until she could. The theory, Dara was told by people who understood it better than she did, described a method for modulating signal propagation through the kind of material the membrane was made of. It did not, technically, describe a method for taking the membrane down, but it described the membrane's behavior in enough detail that anyone who read it carefully enough would understand how to take it down. The paper had been published 20 years ago. The orbital monitoring station had flagged it as interesting, which in the monitoring station's automated classification system meant it was filed under theoretical physics, marginal significance. Nobody in the monitoring station's administrative tier had read it. It was theoretical. It had no obvious applications. Dara read it. She was not a physicist. She was a soldier who had spent 3 years learning to pay attention to things in her environment in ways that the original designers of those environments had not intended. She read the paper 3 times and understood about 40% of it, and what she understood was enough. She thought about Adami in the dark. She thought about the wire from the bootlace. She messaged Layla Adami, who was now 168 years old in the third body of her life, still working, still publishing, still doing something that orbital monitoring stations found interesting without understanding why. She sent the Tanaka paper with a note that said, "I think you know what this is. I think you've known for a while. I'd like to talk." Adami replied in 6 minutes. The reply said, "I've been waiting for this message for 20 years. When are you free?" The meeting happened in person, which both of them wanted. Adami was 168 years old in a body that registered somewhere in its early 50s, with the specific quality of attention that belonged to people who had been doing one kind of work for a very long time, and had gotten past the phase of thinking they knew what it was really about. She had the economy of movement of someone who didn't waste energy on uncertainty, because she'd stopped being uncertain about most things long ago. They met at Sammy Jones's food stand. Dara had introduced Adami to Sammy 2 weeks earlier, and Sammy, who was perpetually cheerful and never quite as settled as he seemed, had understood immediately what he was looking at and had started showing up to the open sessions in the evenings when the stand was closed. Over coffee-adjacent substances and the sound of the city that still gleamed and still didn't quite breathe, Adami explained the paper. "The membrane operates on a resonance principle," she said. "It's not a physical barrier. It's a standing wave. It creates interference in specific M-bands that disrupt certain kinds of transmission. The Kreth designed it to make high-bandwidth communication between Earth and deep space effectively impossible without routing through their relay protocols." She paused. "It doesn't prevent communication. It routes it. Everything goes through their system." "Everything," Dara said. "Everything above a certain bandwidth threshold. Low-bandwidth communications, personal messaging, basic data transfer go through fine. But anything that would allow, say, coordinated large-scale activity between Earth-based organizations and off-world systems, that gets routed." She stirred her drink. "Routed means logged. Logged means visible." Dara thought about that. "The membrane is down," she said. "For 3 years," Adami said. By the time the review comes around again, though, the council will have 3 years of data. If that data looks like what it looked like before the membrane came down, they rebuild it. Bigger. You heard the old council member. What does the data need to look like? Adami smiled. It was the smile of someone who has been carrying a specific answer for 20 years and has finally been asked the specific question. It needs to look like a species that uses 3 years well, she said. Dara went back to the embassy. Valandris received her in the smaller room off the main hall, a space that had been fitted for the in-between scale of a meeting between two people who were not the same size, with 2 sitting arrangements and a window that looked south, toward the water. The Kreth had preserved the old harbor view. Dara appreciated this without knowing why. She laid out what Adami had told her. She laid out the sessions. She laid out the names of people she'd found. 7, now 11, now 17, who had been working on things in the slow decades under the membrane, and had produced work that connected to other work in ways that the monitoring station's automated systems weren't designed to trace. Valandris listened in the way that she listened. Completely, without visible reaction, with the quality of attention that suggested she was not just hearing the content, but mapping it against the interior model she'd been building for 40 years. When Dara finished, the ambassador said, "You're describing a network." "I'm describing what was already there," Dara said. "I'm describing what the membrane turned down to the level of noise. I'm describing what happens when you give it 3 years of signal. The council will not see it that way. They will see coordination. They'll see humans doing what humans do when you give them room," Dara said. "That's the point. That's what you told them they'd see. That's what you've been arguing for 40 years. She paused. "Let them see it." A long quiet. "You are asking me," Valandris said, "to present the review data in a way that frames coordination as evidence of the variable rather than as a threat response." "I'm asking you to present the truth," Dara said. "The truth is that the variable was never dormant. The truth is that the membrane reduced it below the threshold of your instruments but didn't eliminate it. The truth is that Hiroshi Tanaka spent 80 years following a thread that started with a paper by a woman who was the daughter of a soldier who rewired 6 field radios in the dark in 2043. She looked at the ambassador. The truth is that 3 years from now, if your council looks at what this network has produced in the absence of the membrane, they will see something that their models still cannot predict, and that will be the most powerful argument you can make." Valandris looked at her for a long time. "You have changed," she said. "I've been here 8 months, Dara said. "I've had time." "No," the ambassador said. "You have been here 8 months in a body that is not yours, in a year that is not yours, in an aftermath you did not choose, and you have not made peace with it." Something moved across her face. "You have made use of it. That is different." Dara thought about that. She thought about the morning she'd woken up in the wrong bed with the wrong hands and thought, "Okay, work the problem." She thought about how she'd meant it as a coping mechanism, and it had turned out to be something more like a philosophy. She thought about the scar that wasn't on her knuckles and the soldier who wasn't in the room and the year that wasn't her year and the body that was doing the work that needed doing regardless. "Making peace with things is a long project," she said. 3 years isn't enough time for it." She paused. "Making use of things that you can start immediately." Valandris did the thing that was like a smile. "You said I had beautiful eyes," she said. "On the first day, in the hall." "I meant it," Dara said. "I still mean it." "I know." The ambassador looked out the window at the harbor, at the water that was still the Atlantic, that had not been renamed or reorganized or managed into something more orderly. "When you said it, I had been in this building for 40 years. In 40 years, 112 diplomats, 647 corporate representatives, and 4 heads of state had entered this hall. None of them said anything to me that was not a strategy." She paused. "You said something true. Useless as a strategy, true as a fact. You looked at me and said the first true thing that came to you. I told you, Dara said, I wasn't a diplomat. No, Valandris said. You were something more useful. Outside, the water moved. The sky above it was clear in the way that skies are clear when something has recently been removed from them, a quality of openness that takes time to normalize, that the eye keeps checking because the absence still has a presence, the way a healed wound still pulls when the weather changes. Somewhere above that clear sky, an orbital station sat at the L2 point. In 2 years and 4 months, the Council would reconvene and look at 3 years of data. The data would show a network that their models had not predicted. It would show connection across distances and disciplines and eras, the specific shape of a variable that had been waiting in the noise of a managed century for something to change. Dara Voss sat in a room in an embassy that used to be the United Nations, in a body that used to belong to someone else, in a year that was 148 years past the truck on the New Jersey highway, and looked out at the water with the woman who had believed her on the first day when no one else had thought to. She thought 3 years. She thought enough. She thought about Private Adami in the dark, and his daughter, and his daughter's daughter, and the 80-year thread that had started with a paper, and the meeting that had started with an honest sentence about eyes. She thought this is how it starts. Not with a speech, not with a battle, not with the moment when the whole world changes at once in a way that everyone can feel simultaneously. It starts with someone sitting in the dark long enough to notice something that the people who designed the dark didn't think anyone would notice. It starts with the wire from the bootlace. It starts with the true thing that isn't a strategy. It starts with looking at someone, really looking, without the buffer of protocol or the distance of design or the comfortable numbness of a managed peace, and saying what you actually see. Outside the embassy window, the city that was too clean and too quiet was still there. But somewhere in it, in labs and workshops and the backs of apartments and the corners of conversations, something was running, something that had always been running, something that a monitoring station in orbit had been miscategorizing for 145 years as stability. It wasn't stability. It was the held breath before the sentence. It was the variable. And in 2 years and 4 months, when the Council reconvened and looked at the data, they would see it for what it was. Not a threat. Not a problem to be managed. A species that, when given room, filled it. Dara looked at the harbor and felt something she hadn't felt since before the truck on the New Jersey highway, something she'd forgotten she'd been waiting to feel. She didn't have a word for it exactly. It was the feeling of being in the right place at the right time doing the right thing, which she'd felt in the field sometimes, which was the only compensation the field offered that was worth having. She was in someone else's body. She was in the wrong year. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. She thought, okay. She thought, let's work the problem. On the last evening of the 8th month, Dara stood at the top of the old UN building's observation platform. The Kreth had kept it accessible, this too a deliberate preservation, and watched the city below. The sun was going down behind the western structures, painting everything in the teal and orange that the city's angular surfaces loved to hold at this hour. Somewhere out there, 17 people were working on things. 60 now, if she counted the people they'd brought in after the second round of sessions. More if she counted the people the 60 had talked to. Sammy Jones had closed the food stand early and was at a meeting about propagation theory that he didn't fully understand and was attending because he understood the thing underneath it, which was more important. Marie Thorne was writing a document about the settlement negotiations that she had been carrying in her memory for 140 years, waiting for someone to ask her to put it down somewhere that mattered. Layla Adami was on a call with a physicist on the Lunar Research Station who had read the Tanaka paper years ago and set it aside and had just pulled it out of the archive and was reading it again with new eyes. Valandris was inside, in the great hall, doing whatever the ambassador of a species that had been watching for 40 years does when the watching starts to become something else, when observation shades into investment, when the monitored thing becomes the thing you're rooting for even when your council would prefer you remain neutral. The sky above the city was clear. Dara stood in the body that was not her body and looked at the sky that was a sky again, and breathed the air that went all the way up now without interruption, and thought about the truck on the New Jersey highway and what came after, and what comes after that, and what comes after that. She thought the variable is active. She thought hello. Then she went back inside, because the work didn't wait on sentiment and there were still 2 years and 4 months before the council reconvened, and she intended to make them count in every possible way, and that was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was exactly enough, which is the only kind of enough that has ever been worth having.